Have you ever been ignored when you most needed to be heard? Have you ever tried to warn someone and been met with contempt? Comment below, I would have listened to that child. Your courage might inspire someone today. It was a sunny morning, one of those where the light seems to deceive the senses, as if the beauty of the sky hid the invisible cracks in the hearts around it. The breeze blew gently through the cobblestone streets of the city's old town, and the smell of fresh coffee and buttery bread wafted from the half-open doors of the cafes. One of them, in particular, the Park Garden Cafe, was known not only for the intoxicating aroma of its golden-crusted apple pies, but also for its loyal and selective clientele. Elegant ladies, gentlemen in felt hats, and young businessmen flaunting watches worth more than the entire furniture of the place. That morning, seated at the central table, was Mrs. Elizabeth Devereux, widow of an influential banker who had passed away 5 years earlier. With her silver hair impeccably tied in a bun, her gold-rimmed glasses, and a blood-red wool coat draped over her shoulders, she was the embodiment of an era that tolerated no interruptions, neither out of kindness nor much less disorder. Before her rested a steaming cup of tea and a plate with a freshly baked pie, still releasing wisps of vapor. She slowly stirred her small silver spoon in the cup, with an air of weary boredom and a gaze that judged faster than any words. That's when he appeared. The boy, frail, in a faded t-shirt and dirty pants, walked barefoot, taking short, careful steps, as if he had learned not to make too much noise to avoid bothering anyone. His eyes were large and dark, and he carried a torn plastic bag in one hand, containing only a sock and an old orange. His face was all bone and innocence, but his eyes, though small, carried the weight of someone who had witnessed more farewells than birthdays. He stopped in front of the cafe's window, staring at the plate on the old woman's table with an almost ceremonial expression. A moment of silence enveloped everything. The waiter approached to shoo him away, but Elizabeth raised a finger slightly in the air, as if to say, "Let me handle this." She turned to him with a faint, ironic smile, and spoke loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Well, look at that. The little beggar has good taste. This pie here, dear, isn't for you. Go back to your alley." The people laughed with restrained discomfort. The boy didn't respond. He didn't flee, nor did he lower his eyes. He simply fixed his gaze on that pie, as if standing before something sacred. Elizabeth brought the fork to her mouth slowly, keeping her eyes locked on him as if to teach a lesson, and just as the first piece touched her lips, the boy shouted. It wasn't a desperate scream. It wasn't anger. It was something different, something that made conversations halt and spoons freeze in midair. "Don't eat that!" he shouted, with a force that didn't seem to fit in his small chest. The words cut through the room like a silent bolt of lightning. Elizabeth froze, the fork still millimeters from her mouth. Everyone in the cafe turned to him. A waiter hurried to remove him, but the old woman, now pale, stood with effort, her fingers trembling as she set down the cutlery. "How dare you?" she whispered, but something in her tone wasn't anger. It was fear. "It's poisoned," the boy said. His voice was steady, unwavering. "I saw who put it." The tension thickened in the air. A couple stood from the table nearby. An older man dropped his cup, spilling coffee across the white tablecloth. The manager approached with an expression of veiled scandal. "That's absurd, my God," murmured one of the ladies in the back, but Elizabeth didn't react with scorn. She stared at the boy, and for a moment it seemed she recognized something in him. A ghost from the past, perhaps. An echo of forgotten youth. Her face grew paler. Who put it?" she asked, lowering her eyes to the plate. "Him." The boy pointed to a young waiter who had already vanished from sight. "I saw him switch the plate." The manager rushed to the kitchen, and within seconds, the back door was flung open with a loud bang. The waiter had fled. The room became a collective whisper of panic and disbelief. Elizabeth sank back into her chair, her eyes fixed on the untouched plate. The police were called. Tests confirmed the presence of poison. Not much, but enough to kill slowly. A colorless, odorless poison, subtle, perfect for a silent murder. And then, amidst the chaos, the boy was gone. No one saw him leave. No one knew his name. He had vanished like a breeze that only touches those who are paying attention. But Elizabeth, she didn't vanish. She reappeared the next day, seated at the same table, but this time with an empty plate before her. When the waitress came to ask what she wanted to order, she replied, "Nothing today. I just want to keep this table clear. for someone who needs it more than I do." She looked across the street, where a small child silently begged for coins. She stood, crossed the pavement, and handed her a piece of still warm bread. And that night, when the cafe closed, the manager found, tucked under the plate, a small note written in firm handwriting. "Sometimes God sends his dirty and hungry angels to keep us from dying of the poison we ourselves attract." One morning, a few days after the incident, the Park Garden Cafe returned to its usual rhythm, as if the collective scare had been just a passing rumor. The ladies returned with their pearl necklaces, the lawyers with their newspapers spread across the counter, and the waiters, now under strict supervision, resumed carrying trays balanced between occupied tables. But one thing didn't return to how it was: the tense silence that fell every time Mrs. Elizabeth entered. She no longer wore the red coat. She had traded it for a pale grey cloak, almost invisible, as if trying to erase her presence. She walked with less haughtiness, less clatter in her heels, and more care when looking into people's eyes. She always sat at the same table, but no longer in the center. She now chose the table by the window, where days before the boy had stopped. She began bringing a book. She read slowly, but with her eyes fixed on the spaces between the lines, as if searching for answers the newspapers didn't offer. And on the table she always left a second plate, empty but arranged, clean cutlery, a folded napkin, as if waiting for someone. The more attentive patrons noticed, but no one dared to ask. The following Monday, something curious happened. A woman entered the cafe, dressed in simple clothes with a scarf covering her hair. Her eyes were red with exhaustion, and she held the hand of a thin girl who seemed feverish. The woman approached the counter and asked for just a glass of water. The waitress hesitated, glancing at the manager, who in turn checked his watch, as if it told him something. That's when Elizabeth stood and pointed to her table. "Sit with me. The second plate is already waiting for you." The woman didn't understand. She looked around, trying to discern if it was some kind of cruel joke. But the old woman's eyes were different. They were the eyes of someone who had been pierced by a truth too harsh to remain unchanged. They sat. They ate in silence. The girl, at some point, rested her head on her mother's lap, with a faint smile, perhaps for the first time in weeks. When the meal was over, Elizabeth said nothing. She simply stood, took her purse, and left. Where she had been sitting, she had discreetly left $100 bill, folded under the napkin. The gesture began to repeat with variations. Sometimes it was an elderly man who couldn't afford coffee, sometimes a young man in dirty clothes seeking shelter from the rain. Elizabeth never spoke much. She simply offered the second plate, already set. Some accepted, others fled, but she never stopped trying. Then one day, while walking through the now cold streets of late autumn, she stopped in front of a newsstand. The day's headline featured a photo of the missing boy. "Nameless Angel," the title read. The subtitle explained that the police had discovered the fugitive waiter was part of a selective poisoning network targeting elderly people with large fortunes and no direct heirs. Elizabeth felt a chill run through her. She would have been another cold line in the statistics, another wealthy widow found dead of natural causes. That night, she didn't return home. She walked to the city's main square, where a group of homeless people gathered around makeshift fires of cardboard and wood scraps. She sat next to a bearded man playing a two-string guitar. He didn't speak to her. He just kept playing. Elizabeth closed her eyes, and in that rasping, simple sound, she remembered the boy, the scream, the suspended fork, and the words that echoed in her soul for days. "It's poisoned." It wasn't just the food, it was the life she led. It was the pride, the vanity, the indifference that ran through her veins like a sweet, constant poison. And that boy had healed her. She returned home the next day with cold hands and sunken eyes, but with a calm expression. For the first time in decades, she opened her husband's box of letters. There were old notes, forgotten promises, dinners planned and never held. One of the letters said, "If one day I don't come back, remember who you were before all this. The girl who shared half her lunch at recess, remember? Be her again." She cried for hours without shame. The next day she sold her pearl necklace, then her earrings, and little by little she began to give away what she no longer needed, not out of guilt, but because she understood that the true luxury was the silence of a light soul. Meanwhile, the cafe began to change. Inspired by Elizabeth's quiet gesture, the staff started keeping an extra plate always ready. The once indifferent patrons began leaving more generous tips, and the second plate was no longer strange. It was expected. It was respected. And then, on a cloudy winter afternoon, while Elizabeth passed by the bakery, she saw something that stopped her heart. Sitting on the sidewalk with a piece of bread in his hands and a serene smile was him, the boy, cleaner, stronger, but unmistakable. She crossed the street, as if stepping onto sacred ground, and knelt before him. "It's you," she whispered. "You came back." The boy didn't answer. He simply extended a piece of bread toward her, as if repeating the gesture she had once denied to so many. Elizabeth received it with reverence. They ate together there, on the sidewalk, under the cold that no longer felt so biting, and when she blinked, he was gone again. But he had left, on the ground, a small white stone with a hand-carved symbol, an open circle, like an empty plate, an eternal invitation to compassion. The next morning, the Park Garden Cafe opened its doors as usual, but something was different in the air. It wasn't the scent of cinnamon wafting between the tables, nor the sound of cups meeting saucers. It was as if a silent spirit walked among the empty chairs, rearranging the space with a reverence no one saw but everyone felt. The news of the boy's appearance, the same one who had vanished without a trace after saving the widow's life, had spread through the city like a divine whisper. Some said he was just a clever orphan, others a spirit sent by God, but all, even the most skeptical, admitted that something about that boy transcended the ordinary. Elizabeth didn't return to the cafe that day. Instead, she went to a shelter in the suburbs, a place she had once completely ignored. There she found faces that seemed to reflect younger versions of the boy who had saved her. Eyes marked by abandonment, bodies withered by the cold, mouths silenced by the fear of yet another closed door. She brought nothing but bread, blankets, and time. She sat beside them. She didn't speak of charity or forgiveness. She simply listened. Listening became her new luxury. Meanwhile, the cafe's manager decided to place a small, almost imperceptible plaque by the entrance. It read, "Here every day there is a second plate, for whomever God chooses to send." And that simple gesture began to attract people who would never have set foot there before. Luxury and poverty shared tables, not in conflict, but in silence. There were no speeches. There were spoons being shared, napkins divided, stories told with the eyes. One day, an elegant lady with platinum blonde hair, who until then had mocked Elizabeth's poor sentimentalities, entered the cafe and was surprised to see her own grandson sitting with a street boy, sharing a piece of cake. She hesitated but didn't intervene. She sat at a nearby table and ordered the same apple pie. When she finished, she paid for two, and for the first time, she left a generous tip. Days later, during a mass at the city's cathedral, the local priest told a story during the homily, without naming names but with details that left no doubt. He spoke of a woman who carried an invisible poison within her, the poison of indifference, arrogance, contempt for the small. He said that God in his grace had sent a hungry angel to shout the truth, not with theology, but with urgency, and that the shout had echoed not only in a cafe, but in the hearts ready to listen. At the end of the Mass, several of the faithful stood without a word and headed to the small square outside. There they began distributing bread, clothes, hot soup. No one organized it. There was no campaign, no banner. It was a movement of the soul, born from a gesture that began with a shout. "Don't eat that." Elizabeth appeared there too, not in a coat nor with golden glasses, just with her husband's old scarf and a basket of fruit in her hands. A reporter recognized her, approached and asked for an interview, but she declined with a calm smile. "What happened to me isn't news," she said. "It's a seed." That night, as she walked through the streets now damp with light drizzle, Elizabeth had one last encounter. A boy different from the previous one, but with the same pure eyes, approached her and asked, "Ma'am, why do you do this now?" She paused, thought for a moment, and answered with a calm voice, almost like a prayer, "Because one day I almost died, and the one who saved me had nothing to offer me, only the truth, and I decided that if I stayed alive, every day would be a plate set for someone still carrying hunger." The boy smiled and walked away without saying more. She stood there for a while, watching the streetlights reflected in the puddles on the sidewalk, remembering the day her arrogance nearly killed her, and she wondered how many others still live poisoned, not by food, but by pride, rejection, hardness of heart. Before going to bed that night, she took the small stone with the plate symbol from the drawer. She placed it on the dresser, lit a candle, and wrote in her diary, "Today I understood that the most sacred plate is the one offered in silence, without expecting applause, without expecting reward, a plate invisible to the eyes of men, but eternally visible to the heart of God." On the day Elizabeth passed away, much older and surrounded by faces she once would have ignored, the cafe closed for a reason never announced. Only a note was taped to the door in trembling letters. "Sometimes the greatest acts of love come from those the world cannot see." And there, on the glass table that once belonged to the widow, 2 plates were ready, one empty, the other full, both in silence as eternal witnesses that the truth, when shouted with courage, can change the fate even of those who seemed unreachable. The end.